The West played a prominent role in the provocation of the Berlin crisis of the late 1940s. This crisis occurred when the USSR created a blockade around the western zones of Berlin, cutting off all contact with the outside world, including incoming supplies. Despite the Soviet Union instigating the blockade, it was in fact the West's actions that forced Stalin's ultimatum. This went back to World War II and the actions of the Western Allies. Multiple speeches were given, and policies were created to counteract the threat that communism presented for Europe. Despite Stalin's somewhat extreme methods to spread the communist ideology, it was these factors that provoked the Berlin crisis. World War II was a disaster for the Soviet Union. The treatment that they received from the Allies during this time was the start of the provocation towards the Berlin crisis. In 1942, Stalin called on his allies for aid in the form of opening up a new front.
Okay, we have planned. So, what you've got to do, you need to open up a new front against the Germans, split their forces within the war. Splendid idea, little boy. We just need a little bit of time to get ready, and then we'll come join you. Alright, we've given you a whole year. You've got to be ready by now. No, just putting a few finishing touches on the plan, actually. Good news! We're ready. You took your time.
The Allies invaded Normandy in June of 1944, opening up the new front over 2 years after Stalin's suggestion. The war ended a year later, the fighting in Europe even earlier than that. The delay caused Russia a lot of casualties, losing around 25 million people and 66% of heavy industry while waiting for the Allies to attack. Stalin held on to the belief that these losses could have been easily avoided if the Allies had attacked sooner. But this was just the beginning of the West's provocation that would lead to the Berlin crisis. Over the next few years, the West continued to provoke the Soviet Union by presenting speeches that would be broadcast to the world. It started with the renowned Iron Curtain speech given by Winston Churchill in March of 1946, barely 6 months after the war ended.
An iron curtain has descended across the continent. Nobody knows what Soviet Russia and its Communist International Organization intends to do in the immediate future, or what are the limits, if any, to their expansive and proselytizing tendencies. I have felt bound to portray the shadow that falls across the world.
In this speech, Churchill goes into great detail about the problems that face the world, namely war and tyranny, particularly that which stems from communism. This speech frustrated Stalin, who saw it as a move to spread discord amongst the Allied states. However, it was President Harry Truman and his speech in March of 1947 that really started to show the division between Russia and the West. The Truman Doctrine, as it is called, was the first to describe the domino theory, where if one country falls to communism, so will others, hence the need for it to be contained.
To ensure the peaceful development of nations, we are willing to help free people to maintain their institutions against aggressive movements that seek to impose totalitarian regimes.
Truman focused on the aid that was needed to be given to countries such as Greece and Turkey, which had been devastated during the war, as well as to counteract the spread of communism into those countries. In Russia, this was not received well. Stalin called it a capitalist ruse and saw it as the US's way to isolate the USSR from the rest of the world. The provocation caused by these speeches and Stalin's views on their content was just another step towards the events of the Berlin crisis. During the period after the war, the West, and particularly the US, implemented many policies that can only be described as anti-communist, which would heavily provoke the Soviet Union into their final ultimatum of the Berlin crisis. These policies came about after the warning given by George Kennan, the US ambassador in Russia, through his long telegram depicting the threat that communism had on the world. This telegram caused great disturbance in Washington and caused the US to change its policy from one of diplomacy to one of economic and militaristic strength. It also brought about the Truman Doctrine and the policy of containment.
To keep communism contained in the East, the US gave out $12.5 billion worth of aid to European countries under the threat of communism. This would be known as the Marshall Plan and was proposed to Europe in 1947. Alright Europe, we see that you're struggling a bit, so we're going to give you some help out of the kindness of our hearts. Smashing idea. Yeah. And thought of it all by myself. There are a few requirements, however. Suddenly I'm not liking the sound of this as much. You must hold democratic elections in your country to determine the government. Only then will you receive the assistance. Any questions? No, I don't like it. I don't like it one bit. Well, nobody cared about him anyway. Who wants some cash? Oh, I would.
Stalin heavily opposed of both the plan and the policy that backed it up. He saw it as a way of the West trying to diminish his own control over Europe. He refused to join, and any country who was already communist was forbidden to receive the aid.
Despite this, Stalin still felt oppressed and ultimately provoked, which would eventually lead to the Berlin crisis breaking out a year later.
However, the sole blame provoking the crisis cannot be put on the West. The Soviets played a big role with their own policies. Stalin intended for a large proportion of Eastern Europe to become a buffer zone around Russia in case of any future invasion, such as what happened in World War II. To do so, he planted communist parties in each state, such as the SED, the Socialist Unity Party, in East Germany. He would then work behind the scenes to get those parties into power, going so far as to murder members of the Polish underground who had opposed the rise of communism in their country. These tactics were effective to some extent and certainly provoked many of the policies that the West would soon put into action.
However, the West were doing the exact same thing by promoting democracy in the same countries. These hypocritical actions are just another reason as to why Russia would be provoked into instigating the Berlin crisis.
To conclude, despite the fact that Russia was expressively trying to promote communism for their own gains, the West was the greater contributor to provoking the events of the Berlin crisis. Their treatment of their so-called ally, the speeches made against them, and the policies that were created to oppose everything that the Soviets stood for was more than enough to push them over the edge and respond with an ultimatum.
Unfortunately, this response would inadvertently start what is known as the Cold War and usher in a new era of fear and uncertainty that would last for decades.